Imagine a land full of mystery, a place where millions of people would one day travel across oceans, risking everything just for a chance at a new life. A land that would grow into one of the most powerful nations in the world. But how did that story really begin? Today, we start a journey through the history of the United States, step by step, in a way that is easy to understand and enjoyable to listen to. By the end, you will not only know what happened, but also why it matters. Let's go back to a very distant time, long before cities, before countries, before the name America even existed. Around 15,000 years ago, the first peoples arrived on this land. These were Native American tribes. They did not come by ships or airplanes. Instead, they traveled slowly over a land bridge that once connected Asia to North America. These early people lived close to nature. They hunted animals, gathered food, and later learned to grow crops. Over time, they built rich cultures, traditions, and communities. For thousands of years, this land was their home. Now fast forward many centuries. In 1492, an explorer named Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. He was not trying to find America. His goal was to reach Asia faster. But instead, he arrived in the Caribbean islands. This journey was supported by the rulers of Spain. Columbus believed he had reached India, so he called the local people Indians. Of course, this was a mistake, but the name stayed for a long time. It's also important to know that Columbus was not the first European to reach this land. About 500 years earlier, Viking explorers, led by Leif Erikson, had already arrived in parts of North America. However, their settlements did not last. Columbus's journey, however, changed history because it brought lasting European attention to this new world. After Columbus, everything began to change quickly. Countries like Spain, France, and England sent ships across the ocean. They wanted land, wealth, and power. Spain focused mainly on Central and South America, where they found gold and silver. Meanwhile, England and France began building colonies in North America. With these settlers came new animals, foods, and tools, but they also brought diseases. These diseases spread rapidly and caused great loss among Native American populations. This created a painful and complicated relationship that would shape history for centuries. In 1607, England established its first permanent settlement in North America. It was called Jamestown, located in present-day Virginia. Life there was extremely difficult. The settlers faced hunger, sickness, and harsh weather. Many did not survive, but some did, and the colony continued. Soon, more people arrived. In 1620, a group known as the Pilgrims traveled across the ocean on a ship called the Mayflower. They were looking for religious freedom, the right to practice their beliefs without fear. They settled in what is now Massachusetts. Their early days were very hard. They struggled to find food and survive the cold winters. Native Americans helped them learn to grow crops and live in the new environment. To give thanks for this help and their survival, they shared a meal together, what is now remembered as the first Thanksgiving. As the years passed, more colonies appeared along the eastern coast. People came from different parts of Europe, each with their own hopes. Some wanted land, others wanted freedom. Many simply wanted a better life. By the 1700s, these colonies had grown into busy communities full of energy and ambition. But life was not the same everywhere. In the northern colonies, people focused on fishing, small farms, and working together in tight communities. In the middle colonies, farming was very successful, especially growing wheat and grain. This area became known as the breadbasket.
In the southern colonies, large farms called plantations grew crops like tobacco and cotton. However, much of this work was done by enslaved Africans, a deeply painful and unjust part of American history. Even with these differences, one thing connected many of the settlers: hope. They believed this land could offer something new, something better than what they had left behind. But soon a big question began to rise. Who should control this land?
At that time, the colonies were not truly free. Even though they were far away, they were still controlled by Britain. The King of England, King George III, made the rules, and the colonists had to follow them. But there was a growing problem. The colonists were being taxed heavily. They had to pay money to Britain, yet they had no voice in the government. They could not vote or help make the laws that affected their lives. This led to a powerful idea: no taxation without representation. In simple words, they believed it was unfair to pay taxes without having a say. Tensions started to rise. One night in 1773, a dramatic protest took place. A group of colonists secretly boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. To hide their identities, they dressed like Native Americans. Then they threw large boxes of tea into the water. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. It was not just about tea, it was a message. The colonists were ready to resist British control. Soon, things moved from protest to war. By 1775, fighting had begun between the colonies and Britain. This conflict is known as the American Revolution. On one side was the powerful British Army, well-trained and fully equipped. On the other side were ordinary people, farmers, workers, and shopkeepers who believed in freedom. One of their key leaders was George Washington. He became the commander of the colonial army. Another important figure was Thomas Jefferson, who would soon write one of the most important documents in history. In 1776, the colonies made a bold decision. They declared independence. The Declaration of Independence announced that the colonies were no longer part of Britain. It also introduced a powerful idea that all people have certain basic rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was not just a statement, it was a risk. By declaring independence, the colonies were fully committing to war against one of the strongest nations in the world. The war was long and difficult. The British had more soldiers, better training, and stronger resources, but the colonists had something just as important: a deep belief in their cause. They also received support from France, which provided weapons, ships, and soldiers. After years of struggle, a turning point came in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown. The British forces were defeated and their position became weak. Finally, in 1783, Britain officially recognized the United States as an independent country. A new nation had been born. Now came another challenge: how to build a country from the ground up. The leaders created the Constitution, a system of rules to guide how the country would function. It established a government and defined the rights of its people. In 1789, George Washington became the first president. The United States was built on ideals like freedom, equality, and democracy. But in reality, not everyone experienced these ideals. Enslaved people, women, and Native Americans were not given equal rights. While the country had taken a major step forward, there was still a long journey ahead toward true equality. As the new nation began to grow, it looked west. At first, the United States was made up of only 13 states along the East Coast, but people dreamed of expanding across the continent. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a historic decision. He purchased a massive area of land from France.
This event is known as the Louisiana Purchase, and it doubled the size of the country. Suddenly, there was more land than ever before, full of unknown rivers, forests, and mountains. To explore this new territory, two men, Lewis and Clark, were sent on an expedition. Along the way, they were helped by a Native American woman named Sacagaway, who guided them through difficult paths. Their journey opened the door for future exploration and settlement. Soon, many Americans believed it was their destiny to move west and spread across the land. This belief became known as manifest destiny. Families packed their belongings and traveled long distances in covered wagons. They faced dangerous weather, wild landscapes, and uncertain futures, but they continued forward, driven by hope. However, this expansion came with a heavy cost. Native American tribes were forced off their lands and pushed into unfamiliar areas. Their way of life was deeply affected, leading to conflict and lasting pain. At the same time, the country's economy was growing, especially in the South. Large plantations produced crops like cotton and tobacco, but behind this growth was a cruel system: slavery. Millions of Africans were taken from their homes and forced into labor. They worked long hours under harsh conditions with no freedom and no rights. As the nation expanded, a serious division began to grow. Different parts of the country were starting to see the world in very different ways.
By the middle of the 1800s, the United States was no longer united in its thinking. In the North, many people believed slavery was wrong. Their economy was based more on factories, trade, and small farms. They did not depend on enslaved labor, and many began to speak out against it. In the South, the situation was very different. Large plantations depended heavily on enslaved workers. For many plantation owners, slavery was tied directly to their wealth and way of life. They feared losing it. These two views could not easily exist together. The country was becoming divided, not just by geography, but by belief. During this time, brave voices began to rise. People known as abolitionists worked to end slavery. They spoke, wrote, and took risks to fight against this system. One of the most inspiring figures was Harriet Tubman. After escaping slavery herself, she returned again and again to help others find freedom through a secret network called the Underground Railroad. Another powerful voice was Frederick Douglass. He had once been enslaved, but he taught himself to read and write. He shared his story with the world, helping people understand the true cruelty of slavery. Books played an important role. A novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, showed the human suffering behind slavery. It touched many hearts, especially in the North, and increased the call for change. But words alone were not enough to stop the growing tension. By 1861, the situation reached a breaking point. Several Southern states decided to leave the United States. They formed their own government, known as the Confederacy. This action led to a devastating conflict, the Civil War. The Civil War was not only about slavery, it was also about whether the nation would remain united or split into separate countries. Still, slavery remained at the center of the conflict. The northern states, known as the Union, were led by President Abraham Lincoln. He believed strongly in keeping the country together, and he also wanted to end slavery. The war lasted for 4 long years, from 1861 to 1865. It was a time of deep suffering. Soldiers fought brutal battles, families were separated, cities and towns were damaged or destroyed. It became one of the darkest periods in American history. Yet, even in the middle of this hardship, change began to take shape. In 1863, President Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that enslaved people in the Confederate States were free.
While it did not end slavery immediately everywhere, it changed the purpose of the war and gave new hope. Finally, in 1865, the war came to an end. The Union was victorious. The Southern states returned to the United States, and slavery was officially abolished through the 13th Amendment. This was a historic moment. For millions of people, freedom had finally arrived. But freedom did not mean an easy life. Formerly enslaved people now faced new struggles. They dealt with poverty, discrimination, and unfair laws. Even though they were free in name, true equality was still far away. This period after the war is known as Reconstruction. During Reconstruction, the government tried to rebuild the country and support newly freed African Americans. Important changes were made. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. For a short time, there was real progress. African Americans began to take part in politics, education improved, and communities started to grow stronger. But this progress did not last easily. In the South, many people resisted these changes. New laws, known as Jim Crow laws, were created to separate people by race and limit the rights of African Americans. Discrimination and inequality continued for many years. Even so, the fight for justice did not stop. As the country moved forward, another major transformation began, one that would change how people lived and worked every day. This was the start of the Industrial Revolution in America. Instead of farming, more people began working in factories and cities. Machines replaced many manual tasks. New inventions changed daily life in powerful ways. Electricity, developed and improved by inventors like Thomas Edison, brought light into homes and powered machines. The telephone, created by Alexander Graham Bell, made communication faster than ever before. Railroads connected distant parts of the country, allowing people and goods to travel quickly across long distances. These changes created new jobs and opportunities, but they also brought new challenges. Factory workers often worked long hours in dangerous conditions for little pay. Many of these workers were immigrants, people who had come from other countries hoping for a better life. They arrived through places like Ellis Island in New York, carrying dreams of opportunity. And even though life was hard, many still believed in one powerful idea: the American dream, the belief that with hard work and determination, anyone could build a better future.
As the country moved into the late 1800s and early 1900s, the United States was changing faster than ever before. Cities were growing, factories were busy day and night, new inventions were shaping daily life, and millions of people from around the world were arriving, hoping to build a better future. But progress did not come without problems. Many workers faced unsafe conditions. Long hours, low pay, and dangerous environments were common. Even children were often forced to work instead of going to school. In response, workers began to organize. They formed groups called labor unions. These unions fought for fair wages, shorter workdays, and safer workplaces. Leaders like Eugene V. Debs became strong voices for workers' rights. One tragic event made the situation impossible to ignore. In 1911, a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City. Many workers, mostly young women, were trapped inside. The doors were locked and the building was unsafe. The fire led to many deaths and shocked the nation. After this, new laws were created to improve workplace safety. It was a painful lesson, but it led to real change. At the same time, the United States was becoming more active on the world stage. In 1898, the country fought in the Spanish-American War.
After the war, the United States gained control of territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. This marked the beginning of a new role as a global power. Soon after, a much larger conflict began in Europe. In 1914, World War I started. At first, the United States stayed out of it, but in 1917, it joined the war to support its allies. American involvement helped bring the war to an end in 1918. After the war, there was a time of energy and change. The 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties. Music like jazz became popular, cities grew quickly, and in 1920, women gained the right to vote, marking a major step forward for equality. But this period of excitement did not last. By 1929, the economy began to collapse. The stock market crashed, businesses failed, banks closed, millions of people lost their jobs, families struggled to survive. Many could not afford food or housing. This difficult period became known as the Great Depression. People stood in long lines just to receive free food. Many lost their homes. It was one of the hardest periods in American history. In 1933, a new president took office, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, often called FDR. He introduced a series of programs known as the New Deal. These programs aimed to create jobs, support families, and rebuild the economy. The government helped build roads, schools, and bridges. Social Security was created to support older citizens. FDR also spoke directly to the people through radio talks, explaining his plans in simple and clear language. These talks gave hope during a very dark time. While the country was slowly recovering, danger was rising again in other parts of the world. In 1939, World War II began. Once again, the United States tried to stay out of it, but everything changed on December 7, 1941. Japan launched a surprise attack on a U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The nation was shocked. The very next day, the United States entered the war. During the war, people across the country worked together. Factories produced weapons instead of everyday goods. Women stepped into new roles, working in jobs that had once been held by men who had gone to fight. In 1944, Allied forces, including American soldiers, launched a major operation known as D-Day. They landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, and began pushing back enemy forces. By 1945, the war in Europe ended. Later that year, the United States dropped atomic bombs on two cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the war to a close. World War II changed everything. The United States emerged as one of the most powerful nations in the world, with a strong economy and a global influence. But a new kind of conflict soon began. It was called the Cold War. This was not a traditional war with direct battles. Instead, it was a long period of tension between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They competed through ideas, technology, and influence. One major area of competition was space. In 1969, the United States achieved a historic milestone by landing astronauts on the moon. It was a moment that captured the attention of the entire world. There were also dangerous moments, like the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came very close to nuclear war. Thankfully, it was resolved peacefully. During this time, the Cold War also divided places like Berlin, where two very different systems separated. While the country was growing stronger globally, serious problems still existed at home, especially inequality and racism. But once again, people stood up for change. In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights movement gained strength. African Americans and their supporters demanded equal rights and an end to segregation. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. inspired millions with peaceful protests and powerful speeches. Important events followed. In 1954, a court decision ended segregation in schools. In 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott showed the power of collective action. And in 1963, thousands gathered in Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous speech, "I Have a Dream." These efforts led to major legal changes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 protected the right to vote. These were important steps forward, but the journey toward equality continued. As the years passed, the United States kept evolving, facing new challenges, but also creating new opportunities. And today, its story is still being written.